All right, well, let's get underway, and then we'll wrap this up and go on with the rest of our day. So what we're doing this session and the next two are digging into some of the biblical material, and then we're going to circle back and we're going to start doing our adult confirmation program, which will run from basically mid-September through to late October kind of thing. So those sessions will be a different series from this one, but what we're doing the next 2 weeks is looking at the Gospels, excavating the Gospels, and then we'll have 1 week looking at Paul, and that'll just give us a bit of a heads up about some of the bigger headline kind of issues to do with the Gospels and Paul, and we'll take a break for a week or so, and then we'll kick into the what we're going to use as adult confirmation material. And we'll also use it for any of the for those kids that are 15 or 16 or so and are wanting to be confirmed. They can use the same material. So we started with the Gospels, and if you look at this graphic, this is a mosaic from a Byzantine church in a place called Ravenna, which I think from memory is in northern Italy. It's the, as far as we know, it's the earliest image, picture, not a photo obviously, but it's the earliest piece of artwork that actually portrays the idea that the church has 4 Gospels, and they're all in this little special cabinet. Now the interesting thing is that it's Mark, Luke, Matthew, John, so I'm not quite sure how so clearly they weren't thinking of the scrolls, but remember originally, not so much by this stage, as I'll comment in a moment, but originally these documents were possibly scrolls, and then you eventually move to what's called the Codex. The Codex is basically a scroll which is so long, where the long piece of parchment has been chopped into pieces, which we would recognise as a page. Then they're stacked on top of each other, and they're stitched in some way on the left-hand edge. And look, Mum, I just invented the Codex. Okay, so at the time, the Codex was seen as a not very classy way to publish something. It's a bit like the paperbacks, the old sort of penny dreadful paperbacks, which were not proper books, because they didn't have a hard cover and they didn't have proper stitching. They were just glue and a paper cover. So the scrolls took ages to write because one person had to sit there and make the copy, and were very expensive. The Codex turned out to be a fast and cheaper form of technology, and so the book, it was still handwritten, but it was more convenient, and especially people who were travelling appreciated the Codex, whereas the scroll was like trying to carry around. You remember when we were in primary school, down the front there was a box full of maps. They all had to be rolled up and put in individual containers. Not as easy to carry with you as a volume, as a Codex. So one of the interesting things is that the earliest Christians were early adopters of new technology. Okay, that's not what Christians are famous for these days, but they were early adopters of new technology, and they very quickly said, well, it's nice to have a scroll, but no, too slow, too expensive, not worth the bother. So they moved across to sort of what's called the Codex, or the book. So even in this image, the 4 Gospels are books, they're not scrolls. And that was one of the differences between the synagogue and the church. The church adopted books, the synagogue kept using scrolls, and sort of looking down their nose at these cheap Christians who were not investing the money in having proper books. It's a bit like the argument between hymn books and data projectors in terms of hymns in church. Okay, I'm not putting a data projector, I'm just saying it's that argument. Okay. Okay. All right. So I want to offer you a couple of bits of information. First, we're going to do a bit of a mapping exercise and discuss how many Gospels there are and what kinds of literature comes as Gospels. And then we're going to tap into what actual ancient copies, what are the oldest copies of these Gospels. And then finally, I'll just do a couple of, we'll give you a very brief, I guess, sort of taste, a taste of Mark, a taste of Matthew and so on. it'll literally just be one paragraph or one screen, because I just want you to get a sense that each of these books has its own flavour, its own distinctive kind of way of speaking. Anyway, let's get into it. So, start with the obvious question. If we're going to excavate the Gospels, how many Gospels are there? Okay, well, I've got some answers here if you think about it. I see you're making a bid for 4. The theologically correct answer is there is only one Gospel. Okay, but then we're not talking about Gospel books. We're talking about Gospel message. Okay, so the sort of clever, smart bottom theological answer is, well, because there's only one Gospel. And actually, interestingly, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, for instance, in the ancient manuscripts, and I'll show you one later, they're not called the Gospel of Mark, for instance. It's called the Gospel according to Mark. It's only one Gospel, but this is Mark's angle on the Gospel. But it's true, we have only one Gospel, but we have lots of Gospel books. So it's a bit of a trick question. Teachers love trick questions. Students hate them because the teacher's just trying to be smart. Okay, so within the Bible, within the New Testament, there are 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. We know that. And I commented this morning how we use Matthew, Mark and Luke over the 3-year cycle. For some groups of Christians, or some people, when the Gospel of Thomas was discovered halfway through the 20th century, because this is a very early Gospel that we have manuscripts from the 2nd century, same as the other 4. So some people say, well, perhaps there should be 5 Gospels. Okay, but actually, there are more like 30 Gospels. The reason for 22, and this was a number that worked for the Old Testament, there are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So although they don't have A and Z, using our alphabet as an example, in the Hebrew Bible there are 22 books in the Old Testament. And there are 22 letters in the alphabet, so that's it. There can be no more books. See how the symbolism. Now, interestingly, the Greek alphabet has 26 characters. How many books are there in the New Testament? 26. Might be 27, but I mean, it's very, very, I haven't done the count, but I mean, it's actually remarkably similar. That you can't sort of, these models kind of set patterns that people's minds work within.
Would that have been a deliberate thing to do, or is that just how it was at the time? They did, because that's sort of, they did, and then it turned.
You mean the 22 or the?
Yeah, the 22.
Well, in the case of the Jewish Bible, they started, see, the difference between Jewish Bible and a Christian Old Testament is that we have some extra books in the Greek Old Testament. And so one of the arguments then was, well, they wanted to draw a line, and so the argument they used was, well, there are only 22 letters in the alphabet, there can only be 22 books in the Bible. Similarly, in the 2nd or 3rd century, one of the early fathers said, why do we have 4 Gospels? Because there are 4 corners to the earth. Well, we know that argument doesn't really work for us, does it? Because the earth doesn't have any corners.
Humans are always looking for patterns.
Yeah, we're looking for patterns. We're creatures who want to make meaning out of randomness. Okay? And sometimes we're bang on the money, and sometimes it's just a helpful way to think. So what we're going to discover, if we go to that website called Early Christian Writings, and that's way too small for you to read from a distance, these are all the early Christian writings from before about 300 or 400 AD, and many of them are Gospels. So I'll just quickly run down. The Passion narrative is part of the Gospel, but it's seen as a separate book. The Lost Sayings Gospel Q, the Signs Gospel, the Gospel of Thomas, the Oxyrhynchus 1224 Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, the Egerton Gospel, the Gospel of Peter, the Secret Gospel of Mark, the Phiam Fragment, which is a Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke, the Gospel of the Egyptians, the Gospel of the Hebrews, the Gospel of John, and so on, the Gospel of Perfection, and so on. In other words, in the second, third, and fourth century, Christians loved picking up a book that's called the Good News, the Gospel. It was a popular genre. Like today, we might have a novel or a short story, or we might like particular sort of mystery novels, whatever. Early Christians loved Gospels. They also loved Acts, because the acts of whoever were adventure stories of the hero. So the Acts of Thomas or the Acts of Peter or the Acts of John were imaginary stories, but they featured some Christian hero. And these were popular, very popular literature. People would borrow these and swap them and so on. And it was one of the ways that the early Christians, explored their faith. Now, in the end, only 4 of the Gospels made it into the canon, but there were a lot to choose from. Okay, which we're not always aware that it's not like there were only 4 Gospels floating around. There were dozens of Gospels floating around, and so a choice had to be made. Now, the Gospels are of different types. One type or genre of Gospels are Gospels that have no stories in them. They're just collections of Jesus' sayings, like the wisdom of Jesus, the collected wisdom of Jesus. Okay? You went into the bookshop, you'd find it under the section New Age Spirituality, the collected wisdom of Jesus, something like that. And there are a whole pile of these, and none of them made it into the New Testament in their own right, although the first one, what's called the Q Gospel, has found its way into the New Testament because both Luke and Matthew copied it. And so big chunks of Q ended up in the New Testament. Okay? Really, this is next week's topic, but really, really shorthand. In effect, when you look at Matthew and Luke, they've taken the Gospel of Mark and they've added in Q in slightly different ways, and that's what's created Matthew and Luke. Okay? So Q didn't get in on its own right, but it did kind of sneak in because Matthew and Luke copied great chunks of it, put it into their gospel. The others all dipped out. But the point is, at some point in the 2nd or 3rd century, there were Christians who were reading this stuff. And it formed their faith, because they didn't yet have the Bible in the sense that we have it. The boundaries of the Bible were very loose. The second category are narrative Gospels. And obvious difference. These are Gospels that tell a story, and along the way they might have Jesus saying this or saying that, but they're telling stories of where Jesus went, who he met, what he did, what happened to him. So a sayings Gospel won't mention the crucifixion, okay? Because it's a thing that happened, whereas it'll have things like the Beatitudes or whatever, but it won't have the miracles, won't have the storm on the sea and things like that. Now, all 4 of the Gospels that made it into the New Testament, Mark, Matthew, John, and Luke, they are all of this type. So in the big washing machine of 2nd, 3rd century Christianity, as things are tumbling around in the wash, these are the 4 that survive and become official, and the others slowly disappear and get forgotten about. There were Gospels that only focused on the childhood of Jesus. And why would they do that? Well, because the 4 Gospels don't tell us anything about Jesus as a kid. There's one story in Luke chapter 2 of the 12-year-old Jesus going to the temple. The rest of but of course early Christians said, come on, you must have some stories about, what was Jesus like when he went to school? What was Jesus like, as a child? And so 2 of them have survived, the so-called infancy Gospel of James and the infancy Gospel of Thomas. And I'll give you an excerpt from Thomas later. Then we've got Gospels that we just have a tiny piece of, might be just one fragment, or it might be several pages, but it's not the whole document. But from what we have, we know it's not one of the other Gospels, because we can look at the words and go, whoa, those words don't exist in any other Gospel we know about. So the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of the Saviour, the mystical Gospel of Mark, the Egerton Gospel, and 2 Gospel fragments called Oxyrhynchus. Now, Oxyrhynchus was, believe it or not, is a town in Egypt. Okay? And the good thing about Oxyrhynchus is that it was a rubbish dump, 300 AD, 500 AD, and they threw out all, instead of taking them upstairs to the attic in the ministry centre, okay, they threw all their parish council papers and their letters and their school reports, whatever, they threw them out in the rubbish dump. But this is Egypt, and it never rains, ever. They get their water from the Nile River. It doesn't fall out of the sky. So papyrus, which would normally rot away like a piece of cardboard in the garden, the papyrus rubbish dump at Oxyrhynchus survived. And there are thousands of ancient documents. And they're just letters, like a Roman soldier, sending a letter home to mum saying, hope my sister's doing okay at school. Could you send me some more socks? My feet are cold. You know, that kind of thing. So for historians, this is treasure, okay, because it's just everyday correspondence. And amongst the rubbish at Oxyrhynchus are a whole lot of Gospels, copies of Gospels, which the early Christians were reading. And we only know about them because there was no rain in Egypt. Okay? But Egypt was a very strong Christian centre in the 2nd, 3rd, and up until the rise of Islam, Egypt was an incredibly important centre for early Christianity. So for 500 or so years, Egypt was a place where there were powerful bishops and there were big churches, and they had lots of documents going into the rubbish dump.
Have these documents been preserved in this time? Or
Yes.
They're still preserved?
Because we've now found them, they've all gone off to the Cambridge or Oxford, whatever, and they're in the museum.
Yeah.
And scholars study them and do PhDs on them and so on. Yeah. Then there are Gospels that reflect that the community using them are Jewish Christians, not Gentile Christians. So the way they talk about Jesus is he's still more Jewish. He's not really become a Christian. Okay? Gospel of the Hebrews, Gospel of the Ebionites, which means the poor people, and the Gospel of the Nazareans, because Nazarene was a Jewish name for Christian. Okay, you're following the man from Nazareth. Okay, so in that list there were about 30 Gospels that we have copies of, even if the copy is just like half a page. And some of them we have multiple copies of. And in fact there are something like 5,500 papyrus, not just papyrus. There's something like 5,500 ancient manuscripts, either codices or papyrus. Papyrus tends to be one sheet, basically, of some part or other of the Greek New Testament. Okay, 5,500, roughly. Let's say 5,500. Might be 5,825, but let's say 5,500.
At this stage, does a historian get all these Gospels and see how many points are documented in a Gospel, and then they say it's a truth? When do they make it a truth? Just because it's written, it's not a truth.
Correct. And just because you've got 20 copies of one story and only one copy of another story doesn't mean that this happened and that didn't, because we're dealing with the vagaries of what got thrown out in the dump, what survived, what's been found, what got used as kindling to start the kitchen stove. There are all these variables at play. So what scholars have to do is, people who do textual scholarship, is they try to arrange, just like a judge hearing evidence of a court, you try to arrange the evidence in families. Say, so these three people, their stories agree, and there's only one person telling the other story, but maybe it's not 3 against 1, maybe it's 1 against 1, because these three people have spoken to each other, and they've all got the same story, and maybe they're trying to cover something up, and this one person maybe is telling the truth. Now, how do you decide that? Well, it's the judge's job. It comes down to probability. You'll never get proof. So they arrange the manuscripts into family trees. And certain family trees were very influential because they had wealthy backers and lots of copies were made and they happened to survive. And other manuscript trees fell out of favour or were not groups that had wealthy patrons, and or that kind of Christianity died out, and so their documents, there's only a few of them. Okay, similarly, apart from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are about more or less 100 BC, that's very rough, we have no original Hebrew manuscripts for the Old Testament for another 1,000 years, to about 850 AD. Why was that? Because the Christians were finding and burning any copies of the Jewish Bible in Hebrew they could find. So we destroyed 700, 800 years of Jewish manuscripts, okay, because we were in charge of the empire and we didn't like you. So the vagaries of history, of what survived, nothing really survives in France and Italy and Greece because it rains too much. So the climate even has an impact on what survives. So you try to put them into families, and what you're trying to do is not so much recover the original version as understand how our present version developed. Somebody makes a mistake when they're copying and 10 other people copy that copy, the mistake becomes very popular. Okay, so it's not just a case of I think the saying is you need to weigh the evidence rather than count it. It's not just a case of saying, well, 15 people say this, but they might all be lying, or they might have all come from the same family. You want some independent perspective. So that's what's going on.
They say, or I've heard it said that when you're discerning the word of God within the context of whatever you're reading, that and that's what you're saying to me. When you're discerning, there is God's word and truth within it, but you have to discern. It's not all, and the same as when you're listening to a sermon, perhaps, not necessarily listening to God's truth, but you.
Yes, of course.
I mean,
yes, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, but within the context of what I'm saying, there's part of it that is God's truth, and it's up to us to discern it, and then when to bring it in, and for me it just goes down like a typewriter, and then everything else stays up there until I can knock it down there.
Yeah. So you're describing the process of how we use the scriptures.
Yeah.
Okay. What I'm talking about is at even earlier stages, how do they come to exist for us to read them? So already we'll see in a moment. We have absolutely no manuscripts from the 1st century, and we have maybe 3 or 4 manuscripts, papyrus fragments only, from the 2nd century. Okay? So we can only trace the Bible's family history, as it were, back to about 250 AD, the middle of the 3rd century. Now, it's helpful because at the same time as the manuscripts were being used, but they're also they'd wear out and people would dispose of them, other people were quoting the Bible, quoting these books. Although we don't have copies of, say, Matthew's Gospel prior to about 250, we do have Irenaeus and various other people quoting from Matthew's Gospel. So we can tell it was there, but we don't have a copy of it from the 2nd century. Okay, but that's so what I'm looking at today is digging into the history of how we got the Bible. That's a very different conversation from now that we have the Bible and we understand something, that it didn't drop out of heaven, for instance, and that there were arguments about what goes in and what gets out and so on. But nonetheless, now we have a Bible that everybody more or less agrees on. Then how do we use it? Okay, now I would be saying how we use it has to be informed by how we understand its composition as well. That will affect how we listen to, because we will be looking for the nuggets from God, not just looking for Paul's hang-ups about this or that, for example. So a gospel, what is a gospel? What kind of thing is it? What kind of a literature is it? Not quite the same as a biography. certainly not an autobiography, because Jesus didn't write the Gospels. Okay?
But is it what Jesus has actually said? And they're telling that story?
Well, we've got about 30 Gospels, and some of the stuff Jesus clearly didn't say or do. So so part of it is that, I mean, if you're narrowing it down to the 4 Gospels, you might get a tighter definition because they're all narrative Gospels. But if you went to an early Christian and say 250 or 300 and said, could you give me a copy of a Gospel? They might give you the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Mary. They may not give you the Gospel of Mark. So basically, if we just went by the Matthew, Mark and Luke, we'd say it's a kind of biography. Not exactly, but it's kind of, it doesn't give you the whole story and what his parents did and so on, but it's a kind of a biography. But in a sense, we end up saying something like, a gospel is an early Christian text which proclaims Jesus as the Saviour of the world. And it does that by either telling stories about Jesus or giving you examples of his teaching. If you try to narrow it down, we start splitting hairs.
Isn't it a record of the important event that happened that proclaimed Jesus as the Saviour of the world, and that was the important thing. His childhood wasn't recorded because it wasn't important.
Well,
no one recognised him till he started saying that he was the food of life or whatever.
Yeah. Well, some of these people did write down stories about the childhood of Jesus. They just didn't get into the Bible. So, and they made up amazing stories. Most of the time we look at these other stories, we can say, we can see why that didn't get into the Bible. Okay? But if that story had been in the Bible, we'd all be justifying it and saying, oh, well, of course Jesus had powers and he could have done that. So once something ends up in the Bible, then we will defend it. But when it occurs in a document which has not been given the stamp, we say, oh, that's just myth. So there's a bit of, and of course the reality is the canonical Gospels themselves are going to have a mix of what happened and what people imagined. And it's not that, so John's picture of Jesus walking around telling everybody how great he is, that's not the Jesus we see in Matthew, Mark and Luke. So was he in need of therapy? Did he have crazy days, which John recorded, and ordinary days, which Matthew, Mark and Luke recorded? There's a characteristic bias in the way that the different Gospels speak. Luke is very interested in rich people, and also in the sort of role and the status of women. Matthew, on the other hand, is very interested in not upsetting the synagogue and saying we can still be Jewish, We can still be Jewish. So they each have their own kind of spin on what they're saying. So it's not just a case of what this has been recorded, it's more a case of this has been published. And where did it come from? Anyway, let's push on. Now, the manuscript evidence. Firstly, just have a look at what manuscripts look like. This one here, papyrus, we call it papyrus 52. That just means when they started finding bits of papyrus, the ones that had bits of the Bible in them, they started numbering. Oh, that's the first one. That's the second one. Oh, this is the 52nd one. So they're not numbered in terms of their age. They're numbered in terms of when they were found. So this was the 52nd piece of biblical papyrus to be found. It happens to be the oldest piece of the Bible to have survived. And it's a paragraph, not quite. So this is 2 sides of the one little fragment. And it has what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Has about 7 lines, big margin at the top. And you can see how these are the 2 sides of the one piece. See the hole? That's like a thumb, that's like a thumb. That's the 2 sides of the one little fragment. So on one side, you've got a few lines from like chapter 17, and over here you've got a few lines from chapter 18. But there's enough there to say, that's John. and it's the earliest piece of John that has existed. Now, it doesn't tell us that the book from which this is the only fragment remaining had exactly the same 21 chapters as our copy of John. But it does tell us, that, I think it's chapter 17 and 18, I should have looked it up, but it does tell us that at least around about 125 AD, there was somebody who had a copy of John which at least included chapter 17 and chapter 18. Okay? So that's that one. The other one is Papyrus 75. So it's the 75th papyrus to be found. And it's particularly interesting because you notice it's written much closer together. It does have a pretty even hand. This is a well-trained scribe, somebody who writes properly, who's trained to do it. But what we've got here, this is the end of Mark's Gospel. Oops. This is the end of Mark's Gospel. And here is the heading, Evangelion Kata Yohanan, the Gospel according to John. And then this is, in the beginning was the Word was made flesh. So here's somebody's copy of the Gospels, and it has Mark followed by John. Okay, now we don't have all of Mark and all of John, but the bit we have, this is a multi-page papyrus. What we do have is the bit which includes the end of Mark's Gospel, and then the heading and the beginning of John's Gospel. So this was somebody's treasure. This was their private devotional treasure. They like to read the Gospel of Mark and they like to read the Gospel of John. And they may or may not have even heard about the Gospel of Matthew. Okay? That's Greek. That's why I can read it. Yeah, no, it's all Greek to me. Yeah, no, then both fragments are Greek. Again, the early Christians didn't use Hebrew and they didn't use Latin. Okay? Latin was the language of the empire, but not in the East. In the Greek-speaking East of the Roman Empire, everybody spoke Greek. Even the graffiti on the wall was in Greek. So the early Christians are going for the language that everybody speaks at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. Tertullian will be the first Christian thinker who starts to write in Latin. Okay? And then we get a whole different story of the church, with the Latin church taking over. Okay? So that just gives you an example of what these things look like. They're both on pieces of parchment. 52 is just literally a fragment. It's like this, yes, this big. P75 is a much more substantial document. Okay. Don't worry about the detail here, but it's just summing up. So we've just looked at P52, and we're not even going to get to P75 on this slide. But these are fragments of the New Testament, and there's a whole lot of them that are around 200. That really just means we don't know. I mean, it could have been 180, it could have been 220, but they're really just saying, oh, it's around about 200. How are they working that out? By the handwriting. Okay, so if you go back through a family shoebox of memories from great-grandma to grandma to now to our children, if they could still write, you know, and great and grandchildren, if they could still use a pencil and write, you'll notice the handwriting changes over time. Remember the flowery copper plate, the beautiful copper plate, and so on. And so, similarly in the ancient world, using handwriting, you can date a manuscript plus or minus 50 years. So when it says 200, it really means 200 plus or minus 50 years. When it says 250, it really means, well, probably the middle of the 3rd century, plus or minus 50 years. The plus or minus is because grandma doesn't stop writing that way just because you've changed your handwriting. Okay? And you didn't adopt the modern cursive just because your children did in primary school, because that's what the education department said they had to learn now. Okay? So older forms of writing survive while newer ones are growing up next to them. So that's why it's plus or minus. So this gives us a sense. So prior to 200, there's virtually nothing. There's 2 fragments of John, and there's a fragment of the Gospel of Peter, which isn't even in the New Testament. Okay? There's no Mark, there's no Matthew, there's no Luke that early. First, the really important one is down here, P45. It has all 4 Gospels plus the book of Acts. Aha. Now something has happened. This is getting organised. It's also around about 250. Okay? But interestingly, there are fragments of the Gospel of Peter there, and there are fragments of the Gospel of Thomas that are at least as old as the fragments of Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John. This is just a list of what's in some of them. So we've already seen P75, written in the middle of the 3rd century, and it has Luke and, it should say Mark and John. It's a mistake. Okay, it's Mark and John. Pretty sure. Then we find that some of the codices we're finding just have one book of the New Testament. Because remember, people were not putting all 26, 27 books of the New Testament together yet, generally speaking. So there are 16 examples of John, where there's nothing else in the papyrus, the Codex, except for John's Gospel. 14 copies of Matthew, with nothing else, and so on. But only 1 copy of Mark. In other words, Mark was not as popular in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century as Matthew and John. Matthew and John was hitting an audience that Mark was not getting. Okay? And even Luke only gets 7 examples. Then we get some codices that have 2 of them together. Luke John, Matthew John, Mark John, Matthew and Acts. But there's just one example for most of these. So it's relatively, amongst the surviving documents, relatively rare. But Luke and John together are more common. 3 codices. Now you're starting to get a set. So P46 is basically a collection of Pauline writings. Not all of them, but somebody thought this was a good set to have together. Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, not 2 Thessalonians, not Philemon, but it does include Hebrews. So for somebody, around about 200, this was Paul. This was the set of Pauline writings. Okay? P45 we've already mentioned, that's the 4 Gospels plus the book of Acts. And then we notice we're down to 700 and the 600s. Okay? So going back to the early material, the Christian literature was still very fragmentary. There weren't big collections floating around. Now again, we have to say almost all of these examples come from Egypt. So they're really telling us what Christian literature looked like in Egypt. They don't tell us what Christian literature looked like in Spain. Okay, because the evidence from Spain has not survived. So, we can say that all 4 of the New Testament Gospels, we have copies of them from early in the 3rd century, somewhere between 200 and 250. We have those 4 copies, and that's P45. We can also say that Matthew and John were very popular and equally popular. Luke was a distant third, and Mark might as well not bothered. Nobody wanted a copy of Mark, like my PhD thesis. Nobody wanted a copy, or very few. Okay, my mum bought one. No, I gave it to her. So Matthew and John are much more popular than Mark or Luke. But on the other hand, Gospels like the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas have equally ancient attestation in the manuscript tradition and even earlier than some of the canonical Gospels. So my suggestion would be that as the Gospel manuscripts become more stabilised, that's telling us that Christians are becoming wealthier. The Christianity is spreading from the peasants into the more established layers of society where they've got more resources. Okay, and so the Gospels are not just fragments on papyrus, but they're books, and they've got trained scribes. And one of the reasons we know they've got trained scribes is they had standard shortcuts. So you might have seen in icons and holy pictures, you'll often see two letters. It might look to us like an X and an S with a line above it. Well, that's the Greek letters chi and sigma, which are the beginning and the last letter of Christos. And it's what's called a sacronomina. The scribes got sick of writing Christos all the time. They would just go chi, sigma, line across the top. It's like our apostrophe. It meant, I've made an abbreviation here, but you know what I mean. God gets abbreviated. Jesus gets abbreviated. Mary gets abbreviated. Holy Spirit gets abbreviated. Okay, so these were the craft of being a Christian text scribe had become standardized by the time of the big manuscripts in the 4th century. So that tells us that the Christians have got money now and some status. Whereas in the 2nd and 3rd century, the stuff's a bit more scratchy. Okay, now let's have a taste. So what I've done is I've said, obviously there's lots of stuff which is common between Matthew, Mark and Luke. And there's even a couple of stories that are common between Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. So I haven't worried about that so much. I've just tried to give you a taste of what something that's distinctively Mark. Now that's actually hard to do because Mark is very short and Mark got totally recycled in Matthew and Luke. So there are like 2 sentences in Mark which are unique and don't occur in Matthew or Luke. Okay, so interesting. The other thing about Mark is that his favourite word was euthus, and euthus is the Greek word for immediately. And immediately Jesus did this, and immediately Jesus did that. In other words, his writing style leaves you breathless because he has Jesus darting here and darting there and darting there. And Matthew and Luke went, well, that's really bad grammar. So they chopped all those things out. And they changed the way they told the story. So a taster. Start with, and I've gone with the canonical order, not my order. So while I think like most scholars that Mark is written first, I'll go Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, so on. So this is two instances that they're unique to Matthew. Won't find them anywhere else, and they're typical of Matthew. It's Matthew's voice. First one, if you are not listened to when you've got a complaint, take 1 or 2 others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's very Jewish, by the way. Okay? If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. That's one of only 2 times when the word church occurs in the Gospels. And they're both in Matthew. Okay? So church is a Matthean word. Doesn't occur in Mark, doesn't occur in Luke, doesn't occur in John. That may or may not surprise you. And then if they still won't listen even to the church, you're to excommunicate them. They're to be like a Gentile and a tax collector. You're to kick them out. This is very Jewish. This is Jewish Jesus 101. Okay? Or chapter 23, Jesus said to the crowds, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do whatever they teach you, but don't copy what they do, because they don't practice what they teach. Okay? Again, this is part of Jesus, or Matthew, having a problem with the Pharisees and the scribes and doing it in a very Jewish way. This is sort of vintage Matthew. Okay? Very Jewish. Now, what does that tell us? It tells us that the Christian church that was using Matthew's gospel was still very close to Judaism. They had not yet separated. Okay? Now, in Antioch, Christians were still going to the Jewish Passover as late as the 500s AD. So this is probably from Antioch. That's what we pick up from things like that. Mark, this is it. This is the only thing that's in Mark which is not found either in Matthew or Luke or both. For everyone will be salted with fire. And then a little half a verse later, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. Everything else in Mark has been copied. Now, I often joke that if Matthew and Luke were students at high school or at university, they'd be brought up before the head of school on plagiarism charges. This is the only bit of Mark they didn't copy. But the other thing it reminds us is that often in the oral stage, sayings will be remembered because they have a common word. In this case, it's salt. And so I think if you looked at the in-between material, probably has salt as well. So you collect a number of sayings, you remember them. There are 5 things about salt, so you can chant them off. Luke. This is the story of Jesus going up to the temple as a 12-year-old boy and staying behind and being found talking with the experts and so on. And so this is classic Luke. And what I'm saying is classic Luke. It's only found in Luke, but more importantly, it shows Jesus respecting the traditions. And Luke is writing for a Roman audience, and Romans insisted that you must show respect for the traditions. So one of the things we find in Luke and in Acts is that Christians are always good, law-abiding citizens in the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles. Sure, there's problem, but the problem is always stirred up by the Jews. And Luke is making a point. Okay? We're nice people. We obey the law. We respect the tradition. We listen to our leaders. We understand authority. Okay, so that's Luke, a little taste of Luke. Then there's just to remind us that there are obviously almost everything in Mark also shows up in Matthew and Luke. So there are things that they share, and there are even a few things that pop up in John as well as Matthew, Mark and Luke. And here's one of them. Mark chapter 1 has, they went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, he entered the synagogue and taught. They were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not like the scribes. Like, guess what we think about you. Matthew has, he left Nazareth and made his home in Capernaum by the sea, in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali. So it's a bit more detailed. He's put in a bit of proper Jewish information around it. And he actually has Jesus moving to Capernaum because there's a verse in Isaiah that says, O land of Zebulun, land of Naphtali, on the road by the sea, cross the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, people that sat in darkness have seen a great light, and so on. So Matthew makes Jesus moving to Capernaum a fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. But he still has Jesus moving to Capernaum. He doesn't stay in Nazareth. And later on in chapter 7, Matthew has, when Jesus had finished saying all these things, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority, not as their scribes, word for word agreement. But Matthew has put it at the end of the Sermon on the Mount instead of Jesus' first day in Capernaum. And Luke has, he went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee. Actually, Luke, that's wrong, it was a village. He went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, was teaching them on the Sabbath. They were astounded at his teaching because he spoke with authority. Clearly, these 3 boys have been copying each other's work. Okay? But even John has, after this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. So even John has Jesus going to Capernaum.
How old was he? Approximately.
When?
When he went to Capernaum.
Oh, right. Okay. I can tell you how old he was when he was born.
Approximately.
Approximately 0.
Right.
So the trouble is we don't know. Okay. The tradition is that he started doing this when he was 30 years old. Okay, and that I think comes from Luke chapter 3. And Luke likes nice bundles. So certainly he's an adult, and in Luke he said he's 30 years old when this happens. In John's Gospel he's younger than 50. But then most people were dead by 50 in the ancient world. So if you're still alive, you're younger than 50.
Killed you.
Yeah, you haven't died of disease, you haven't got a cold, you haven't been sold as a slave or whatever. So yeah, When we try to construct a biography of Jesus out of the Gospels, it becomes tricky, because what's going to count as fact? So we've done Matthew, Mark, Luke, and the shared tradition. Then there's John. Well, this is classic John. John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the... This is classic highfalutin Johannine theology. Okay? So we can sort of recognise the Johannine voice almost. It has a distinctive soundtrack. What about the Gospel of Thomas? Well, there are lots and lots of examples, but here's one. It's interesting. I chose this for you, Alan. Jesus said, I'm the light that is over all things. I am all. From me all come forth, and to me all attain. This could almost be the Gospel of John. Okay? Split a piece of wood. I'm there. Lift up a stone. You'll find me. Okay? I'm everywhere. There's nowhere you can go where you won't find me. But split a piece of wood. I'm there. Okay? Lovely metaphor. Probably not something Jesus said, but it's in the Gospel of Thomas. Then we get things that just live outside the Gospels, but they got remembered. And the most famous one is the quote, woman taken in adultery, caught in the very act. But there's only the woman. Guy jumped out the window, ran away, whatever. Okay, it's the woman who's in trouble. Of course, that's always how it works, ever since the Garden of Eden. Okay. Adam only ate the piece of fruit because Eve shoved it down his throat. Okay, he didn't want to have it. So this is a classic. This is that beautiful story of a woman being brought to Jesus. The religious leaders, the scribes and the Pharisees, want Jesus to say, "Yep, take her out to the outside of town and stone her to death." And remember, he says, "Let the person without sin cast the first stone." And beginning with the oldest, they all began to walk away. Beautiful story. It does not belong in Luke's Gospel. In the oldest manuscripts, it's not there. It doesn't belong in John's Gospel. In the oldest manuscripts, it's not there. But by the time we get down to the 4th, 5th century, this story has wriggled its way into Luke or into John. This is actually John chapter 8.
Is it wriggled in because it's a good story?
Absolutely. And the church was saying, this is a keeper. Okay. So if you're in a church that only has John's Gospel, but you know this story, Rector, can we just kind of add this one into the readings? It's such a good story. Okay. Never made it into Matthew. What a surprise. Matthew would say stoner. Okay. But Luke and John, the gospel tradition of Luke and John made room for this story a couple of hundred years later. It kind of find its way in. So, is that part of your Bible or not?
Very, very.
It's a good story.
It's a really good story, but it wasn't in the original version of Luke, and it wasn't in the original version of John, and it had never been in Matthew, and it's never been in Mark. Is it part of the Bible, or is it a textual addition that we should throw out? No, it's too good a story.
But they must have had good reason apart from it being a good story.
Well, it's a story that goes to the heart of forgiveness.
Yeah.
So it's a good story. Yeah, it's a special story. It's a powerful story. Let him without sin cast the first stone. That's a powerful... The fact that the church, without ever taking a vote, somehow or other this story wriggled its way in to some of the manuscripts of Luke and some of the manuscripts of John. Technically, it doesn't belong in either gospel. It's not the only story like this. There are various stories that have survived, but they're not actually part of the Gospels.
The story's woven into without being in actual words, it's woven in.
So you're voting in favour of putting this in the lectionary for the cathedral?
Yeah, but
Sure.
not because it is a good story, but that wouldn't be the reason.
Well, by good we mean powerful and
Yeah,
speaks to
it's
us.
powerful because
Yeah.
of Jesus, I think, and why he came.
Oh, but there are... Okay, well, let's see if this one speaks to you. This has as much history to it as the other one. It's not in any of the Gospels, but it is in the infancy Gospel of Thomas. I'll read it out to you. The boyhood deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ. So already we think, this is coming from a time when Christianity is a bit more organised, and they want to know the legends of the Jesus child. I, Thomas the Israelite, am reporting to you, all my non-Jewish brothers and sisters, to make known the extraordinary childhood deeds of our Lord Jesus Christ, what he did after his birth in my region. This is how it all started. Or, once upon a time in a faraway land. Okay, you can hear what's going on here. All right. When this boy, Jesus, was 5 years old, he was playing at the ford of a rushing stream.
Move over a bit.
Sorry, my block.
Thank you.
Okay. He was collecting the flowing water into ponds and made the water instantly pure because it's Jesus. Okay, he couldn't help himself. He just constantly, making things holy. All right? This is like the opposite of King Midas, who everything he touched turned to gold. Everything Jesus touched just becomes beautiful. Okay? He did this with a single command. He then made soft clay and shaped it into 12 sparrows. He did this on the Sabbath day, and many other boys were playing with him. But when a Jew saw what Jesus was doing, mind you, Jesus was Jewish, his father was Jewish, the boys playing in the mud with him are Jewish. Okay, but this is told by a non-Jewish storyteller, obviously. When a Jew saw what Jesus was doing while playing on the Sabbath day, he immediately went off and told Joseph, Jesus' father. Interesting comment, by the way. See here, your boy is at the ford and has taken mud and has fashioned 12 birds with it, so he has violated the Sabbath. He's also broken the 10 Commandments about not having graven images and various other things like that, but never mind. So Joseph went there, and as soon as he spotted him, he shouted, "Why are you doing what's not permitted on the Sabbath?" But Jesus, being a little clever boy, Jesus simply clapped his hands and shouted at the sparrows, "Be off, fly away, and remember me, you who are now alive." And the sparrows took off and flew away noisily. The Jews watched with amazement, then left the scene to report to their leaders what they had seen Jesus doing. And we all say, yeah, that really happened. No, we all say, that's a legend. That's a made-up story. We can see why they're telling it, but it has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. But in the 2nd century, Christians were sharing stories like this. Hey, have you read the story about Jesus? And if you really want a good one, Alan, look up get all this on the internet. Look up the account where Jesus goes to school, his first day at school, and the teachers. Joseph brings him and introduces him to the teacher, and the teacher says, "So, Jesus, do you know your alphabet yet?" And Jesus said, "You tell me who made the world and what was before anything existed, and I will tell you whether or not I know my alphabet." What a headache this kid is going to be in your class. He knows everything about the universe. Okay? He's not going to join the choir. He sings with the angels already. Why would he join the choir? Okay. So this is stuff that the early Christians wrote. And for some of them, this was, on the edge of Scripture at least. For them it was gospel. And then we get a kind of sideways reference. I'm going to finish more or less with this. This is from the end of John's Gospel and also from the beginning of Luke. Okay? So we're at least 100 years after Jesus, basically, with John and with Luke. So there's a little bit of perspective, a bit of depth of field. So at the end, and John has 2 endings because someone added an extra chapter at one stage. So at the first ending, at the end of chapter 20, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. End of story. That's why I wrote the gospel. Then chapter 21 gets added, so it needs another ending. Okay? But John's Gospel grows over time. There are many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So it's a reiteration, but an expansion of the idea that we find at the end of 20. And the opening paragraph of Luke's Gospel, Luke 1:1-4, this is the only time in Luke where he speaks in the first person. Everything else is third person. He said, they said, whatever, okay? And it's addressed to Theophilus, most excellent Theophilus, okay? Since many have undertaken, okay, by the time Luke is writing, many people have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us. In other words, there are lots of Gospels out there already at the time that Luke is being written. Just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the Lord. In other words, Luke is not a first generation Christian. He's at least second or third generation. There's been a history. Lots of books have been written. Lots of information has been passed on from the old people, from the people back there who were the originals. I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Very similar catechetical kind of aim. In other words, I'm writing this, I'm gathering this material, I'm sifting it because I want you to have accurate information as part of your catechesis, as part of your Christian formation. That's what John is telling us at the end of his gospel. That's what Luke is telling us at the start of his gospel. Okay? So, what have we found? What's here? But next week we'll actually look in more detail at Matthew, Mark and Luke and how they interact. But what have we discovered about Gospels in the life of the church in the first 300 or so years? What have we learned out of all this yabbering?
It's just stories handed on by people to other people, and as it's handed on, it is changed slightly.
So there is a process of tradition, information being handed on, and also information being created, being invented, like the Jesus with the clay birds. I mean, that's clearly an invented story. Apart from anything else, there was no stream with a ford in Nazareth in the first century. But leaving that mere detail aside, okay, this is clearly the kind of thing. But see, if the story of Jesus going to the temple as a 12-year-old, if that was in the infancy gospel of Thomas, we'd say, oh, Thomas just made that up. But because it's in Luke, we say, oh, it happened. Okay, maybe it didn't. We can see why it's there. Whether it happened, that's a whole other question. So here we have these stories, tall tales and true, and tall tales and not so true. A lot of literature circulating. I mean, it wasn't just one or two. There were dozens of early books that claimed to be a gospel. And at the time, there was no New Testament, remember? Okay.
So it's a human construct, and the form we have was put together a long time after the actual events that got drawn.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the New Testament, the timelines are shorter than in the Old Testament, sure. But basically, by the beginning, I haven't mentioned this, but by the beginning of the 3rd century, we get a little document fragment called the Muratorian Canon, and it's a list of the books which are authorized to be used in church. It's more or less the New Testament, except that it includes the Epistle of Barnabas and the Gospel of Peter, and so on. So in other words, at Easter time, early in the 3rd century, when this particular list of official books was put out, firstly, there was a need for a list because people were getting confused as to which books had status and could be read in church and which books were just fun things to read on the veranda on Sunday afternoon. Okay, so there was a need for a book, and people were the church leaders wanted to put a bit of order here and stamp out some of the creativity on the edges. But then the list they came up with in the so-called Muratorian Canon is not exactly the same as our New Testament. So we're not there quite yet. Go forward another 100 years to Constantine, the first Christian emperor, and he has published 50 copies of the Bible. This is the Bible as published by the emperor. So like, this is the Bible. This is when someone says, okay guys, this is the list. But even Codex Sinaiticus, which is probably one of Constantine's Bibles, found at St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, certainly an early 4th century copy of the Bible. So it's probably one of the 50 Bibles. It's actually it still exists. It's the only book from the Roman Empire that physically still exists as a book today. It has the Old Testament with the apocrypha. Okay, so the larger Old Testament. That's bad news for the Protestants who want to have a Protestant Old Testament. And the New Testament still includes the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. So even in Constantine's time, the New Testament hasn't quite lined up the way we're familiar with it. Okay? And with the New Testament, the decisions were being made ad hoc by the person who was writing that codex, or, in the case of Martin Luther, the person who was getting a copy printed determined what was in the canon. So we might remember that Martin Luther didn't like the Epistle of James because it didn't fit with his theology, so he put the Epistle of James in an appendix after the New Testament. Okay? So as recently as 500 years ago, beginning of the printing press, there was still a bit of wriggle room as to what went into the New Testament and what was pushed out of the Old Testament. Basically, it's like creating a hymn book. You choose what you want in and you leave out the stuff you don't want.
Was Constantine the era where Christianity became a milestone? Is it a milestone in history?
Yes. Constantine is when the emperor of Rome... Well, no, he doesn't make Christianity compulsory, but he becomes a Christian.
Oh, right.
And that kind of makes Christianity cool in the empire. Like if you want a job in the senior ranks of the Roman government, you'll be a Christian now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Constantine is the one who signed off on the Nicene Creed because the Christians were fighting each other. How much of God was Jesus? Okay? Was he a God, the God, fully God, partly God? This is bad for the government. Constantine calls all the bishops together to a place called Nicaea. He locks them in the meeting room. He puts his soldiers around the outside with spears. And he says, now, my bishops, we are going to solve this problem. And no one is leaving the room until we have agreement. Here is my draft resolution for solving this problem. And guess what? They adopted it. They had a choice, but they adopted it. That's how we got the Nicene Creed. Okay? It then comes out with the authority of the emperor, along with 50 copies of the Bible. This is what we believe, and this is the book we all read, because the emperor has made 50 copies and given them as a gift to the 50 most powerful bishops. Like, which Bible are you going to use in church now? I think we'll read the one from the emperor. But we've always, I know that, but I think we'll use the one the emperor sent us from now on. Bingo, there's the canon. Okay? Now it'll be another 100 years or so before a church council says, let's officially adopt the canon, but actually Constantine did it in 325. 10 years after he became emperor. He's a very clever man. He never got baptised until he was about to die. Sort of having a bob each way.
So does our relationship with God, or is our relationship with God dependent on if we believe in these stories, or if they're the truth or if they're not the truth, sort of thing. Sort of, I don't think they are. I think they're all part of everything. But my relationship with God isn't dependent on the stories.
Correct.
And all of that that are in the Bible. It goes beyond all that.
Sure.
Incorporates it.
So the Bible, one way, again, I'm using metaphor. One way of doing it, say, well, the Bible is like grandma's table. It has lots of bumps and scratches on it. But that's because the family has sat around that table for 80 years. And things got bumped and scratched, and dishes got put on the table when they shouldn't have been, and all the rest. But that table with all its bumps and scratches, that's the family table. And lots of big, important family stuff happened around that table. In a similar kind of way, the Bible has all sorts of bumps and scratches. And even when we say the Bible, the Catholic Bible is not the same as the Greek Orthodox Bible, which is not the same as the Armenian Bible, which is not the same as the Coptic Bible, it's not the same as a Baptist Bible, not exactly the same as an Anglican Bible. Okay, there is no such thing as the Bible. Different cultural, ethnic communities in the world have slightly, there's 80%, 90% is the same, but there's a little bit around the margins. But when we just live in our own cultural bubble called Western Christianity, okay, we think our version of the Bible is the Bible. Now, an Ethiopian Christian's going to have a slightly different version of the Bible, but they still do the same thing. They read the Bible, they're listening for what God might be saying to them, and that Bible is going to shape their religious imagination so they can imagine what God will be asking them to say or do or think. And depending how deeply they go into the Bible, they might realise that sometimes the Bible says things that don't sit together, and so we've got to decide for ourselves. Now, the Jewish people worked that out a long time ago. There's a lovely story in the Talmud, I guess. A group of rabbis having an argument, as they do, about how to interpret some piece of Torah. And one of the rabbis said, "I believe I'm right, and I believe God agrees with me." The heavens open, and Hashem says, "Rabbi Eliezer may be correct in his view of the Bible, but I've given you the Bible, and it's up to you to work out what to make of it. It's not my job to tell you how to make sense of the Bible. Good day," and the heavens close. God's not going to take sides in how we read the Bible. We do. We turn into tribes, but God is not going to take it. The Jewish wisdom says, actually, it's up to us. We've got to make sense of this.
So when we read the Bible in church, afterwards we say,
like this morning,
the word of the Lord.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we really be saying something like, this is the word of the Lord?
Yes. There are various, and there's also tone of voice.
Yeah.
Okay. So many years ago, when I was at Deception Bay Parish, my first parish, I was their first priest, and we had the reading from Proverbs 31, which is the good wife. Who can find a good wife? And it describes what the good wife does. She's up in the morning, crack of dawn, getting breakfast on, going out to the marketplace, buying fresh vegetables, looking after a family, sewing, going to the market, trading, just so that her husband can sit in the city gate and have prestige and status along with the men of the city. And my wife was down to read that day, and she got to the end of the reading, and she said, "This is the word of the Lord?" She didn't change the word, she just changed the intonation. Of course, people go, "Well, come on." Okay, so as you can imagine, in the revision of the prayer book, there's been a lot of discussion about that. The old prayer book said, "Here endeth the lesson." Factually correct, but it doesn't really say much. Okay. Then we had, "This is the word of the Lord." I think in the current Australian prayer book it says, "Hear the word of the Lord." I'm not sure what we say.
Yes, I think it says, "Hear the word of the Lord."
What do we say? What did you say this morning?
I said, "Hear the word of the Lord."
Okay, yeah, because in the Roman Catholic lecture you'll still say, "This is the word of the Lord." I think we now say, "Hear the word of the Lord."
Yeah.
In Aotearoa, New Zealand, the Anglican prayer book says, "Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Thanks be to God."
I think the Uniting Church say that too.
Yeah, well, they've pinched it from the Anglicans in New Zealand. But you see, that's actually a much more nuanced.
Yeah.
It's saying, why do we read the Bible? Not because we're focusing on the words of the Bible, because we want to hear what the Spirit might be whispering to the church. And sometimes it'll be exactly what the Bible says, and sometimes it'll be the opposite. Blessed are they who take your little ones and dash their heads against the rocks. This is the word of the Lord. Well, no. Okay, this is a grumpy person who's been through a tough time and he's announcing a curse on his enemies. Now, we've all been in times like that. But hearing what the Spirit is saying to the church is not quite the same as saying, go out and curse your neighbour because their barbecue party was too late last night and kept you awake. Yeah, so we do, I believe, we have permission to respectfully disagree with the Bible as part of listening to God. Of course, we've always got to be checking back against the Bible. That's our benchmark. But the benchmark is not pure gold. The benchmark is an alloy at times. Okay, like Solomon, what do you have, 300 wives, 600 concubines? This is the biblical model of marriage? I don't think so. That's what rich and powerful men do. Okay, it's not what God is endorsing. That's power. Okay, so reading the Bible is not the same as using the Bible as a sacrament to hear us listen to God, which I think is what Kay is describing. Yeah. All right, one last image. This is the beginning of Mark's Gospel in Codex Sinaiticus, the Codex from Mount Sinai, the oldest book in the world, physical book in the world. Look what a beautiful book it is. That's just one page. Look at the columns. Remember, this was once upon a time a parchment scroll, got chopped up into pages. They've still kept the 4 narrow columns in the width of the page because it's just really a slice of scroll. And you may be able to see, it's obviously it's also marked up into little sections for reading in church. There's already a lectionary. And these markers are saying this is the bit, then you read the next bit, then you read the next bit. So it's already been broken up into chunks for reading. It's even got corrections. See over here and up in here and so on. Someone's gone back later and said, actually you left out this bit. All right. This is just a zoomed in on it and get us, there's so much light. Up here it's saying kata marken, according to Mark, kata plus the accusative of Mark, and then you've got, now again notice one of the things we could all see is this is written with no spaces between the words. So you've actually got to know what it says in order to read it. Okay? So, Arche to Jesu, it's a bit hard to read. I might read it from here. It's darker on my screen. So, Arche to, Arche to Euangeliu, and then it's got what looks like an I and a Y with a bar across, which is Jesu. And then it's got an X and a Y, which is Christu, with a bar across. So it doesn't even bother to write Jesus Christ. It's using the little abbreviation. So the Evangelion, Jesu, Christu, let me just find it. And that's right, and that's right. And the thing about this one is that because I was looking for what we all know that Mark's Gospel says, beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. This doesn't have the Son of God. It just has the beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ. Now I was looking to find the words for Son of God, and it's not there. I went, oh, that's right. It's Sinaiticus. It's not going to be there. Okay, so it goes straight into the quote from Isaiah in the halfway through the second line. But this is beautiful handwriting, beautiful, beautiful scribe. And the people that have written other little comments later on, okay, don't have the same quality of writing when they've added little comments in here and there to correct the text. Okay, but this is the world's first Bible. Okay, courtesy of Constantine. round about 340, 330, whatever. Now, mentioning that date, exactly the same year, 330, 5 years after the Council of Nicaea, Constantine founds a new city in what we call Turkey called Constantinople, named after himself, the city of Constantine. He issues coins to celebrate the founding of the new Rome, because that's what Constantinople was to be, the new Rome, because the centre of gravity was in the east. What does he put on the coins? He doesn't put a picture of Jesus. He puts a picture of the she-wolf nursing Romulus and Remus, the mythic founders of the city of Rome. He's a Christian emperor. He's made Christianity his religion. He's sorted out the creeds. He's published the Bible. But now he's building a new Rome in Asia Minor, Turkey, what today is Istanbul. Okay? It stayed Constantinia until the late 19th century. Okay? So he's creating the new city of Rome, so he wants to invoke the legend of Romulus and Remus, who were nursed by the she-wolf, according to the ancient legend. Okay, so he's the first Christian emperor, but when there's a big government job on, you push all the buttons for the pagan symbolism, because that's what will get across to the people. These days it's called football and circuses and so on. Okay, let's call that quits for today. Hope you found that interesting. And so next week what I want to do is focus more on the relationship between Matthew, Mark and Luke. And then the week after that we'll try and get a bit of a handle on Paul, where Paul fits into earliest Christianity, and do it all in about an hour and a quarter. Okay?